Okay, so as you saw in the opening of this particular video, there was an unusual car. For those of you that are not familiar with the Zagato bodied cars, we have another Zagato we need to get back onto that we shelved for a little while. So this car is kind of encroaching on that time frame. This started out being, you know, just taking care of some jack point issues and minor things into a big full-fledged floor restoration. So everything that was literally associated with the floor of this car, we have either recreated here at the shop, or we were able to get a couple small pieces, you know, factory replacement pieces for this. But effectively, just about everything on this thing had to be fabricated here in the shop. One of the things, and I don't know how well this is going to come show up, but one of the things that we had to reproduce was the motor mount mechanisms that are attached to the chassis. Okay, this is the original one, and for all accounts it looked fairly innocent enough when we first started, but as Johnny started to dig into this, we realized that the wall strength of this cup, the integrity of it, wasn't there. It wasn't going to stand up for long-term use. At some point in time, somebody had permanently welded this to the chassis, which made this car probably a little too rigid and not compliant during its performance, you know, handling situations. So when we went back and isolated this again, this entire section here had to be replaced because effectively very little metal was still there. The owner was able to source the appropriate isolators. There's two of them. One I can show you because we still have it in hand, which is this one. This one goes inside this cup, okay, like so. And then there's one that's up inside here. Now all this section here is in-house fabrication. This isn't available stuff, so we had to make it. And Johnny, being conscientious about integrity of the car, made this out of substantially bigger wall tubing. So this is probably twice the thickness of the original, but ideally it fits perfectly on the cups. So there's a rubber isolator here, there's a rubber isolator, this one that goes right here, and this is all coming back together quite well. But this is kind of bringing me to the point where you go to the doctor because you got a scratch, and it turns out it's this huge infection. It's going to take a ton of antibiotics to get it straight. This is a perfect example of the same thing. Came here, we're thinking there's just a few incidental things we need to take care of, and it just became this massive, massive job. It's not something we were looking forward to doing. It's not something certainly the owner was looking to do, but effectively it was something that had to be addressed. From our perspective, it really kind of, again, encroached on timeline and other projects we wanted to get onto. But once you got this thing with no floors in it, what are you going to do? You got to put it back together so the guy can drive it. So, you know, this is where dialogue's everything. As we were going, we made sure the customer was very aware of what he was running into. As the business side of this, we can only take so much ownership of it because we didn't create the problem, but we also didn't expect these problems either. So the point is this: if you're going to get a Zagato bodied something or another, just assume there's issues, because as elegant and as beautiful aesthetically as these cars were, they weren't put together very well. And the way they were constructed, as in the next Zagato you're going to see, the Flaminia GT that we have, this is what it's going to be. It's going to be where the way they constructed, the metal laps over one another, which is just giving you huge, huge opportunities for rust to exist. When we first started in on this car, we found newspaper stuffed in here from 1972. This car was only a couple years old at that point, so that's just a good indication of the construction process early on in its life. Johnny's going to show you in a few minutes here what else we're doing, because now that we have to fabricate the firewall where it meets the floor, we're also going to make sure that's not a lap weld like it used to be. We're going to weld all that in and enclose those welds so it doesn't have an opportunity for rust to form in little pockets. That's the kind of stuff that drives you nuts, because you have to constantly think about where would rust go, and you have to try to fight it to where it doesn't show up. We'll show you what that's all about.
As you saw earlier, I had to fabricate the lower sections of the firewall to meet up with the new floor pans. And so we've got seams here that are open. Well, this car, if we were to leave this the way it is now, it's strong, but if we were to leave it the way it is now, as the car's driving down the road with the rain that we get in the northwest, you'd get all this water going into both of these panels of metal, and being sandwiched in between both panels, and that's where rust begins. So what we're going to do is we're going to weld up this entire seam to add really a lot of rigidity to this floor. And what that's going to do is that's going to seal the water from ever going in there. On top of that, after this is all fully welded, seam welded all the way, we're going to get some seam sealer on here, and we're going to cover this up with seam sealer. So it's going to look like a factory finish, and it's going to make sure, for sure, with weld and seam sealer, that no moisture is ever going to get in there ever again. This floor will not rust. We're a restoration shop. That's what we do. We make sure that these cars are restored, not just to factory standards, but better than the factory standards, or else this thing wouldn't even be here. Now, here's another thing that I've got going on. As you can see, I've got this weld blanket. What it's doing is it's covering up the fuel lines and the brake lines, and I've got the fuel lines pulled away from the floor so that, you know, I don't burn through that plastic fuel line and cause an explosion. I gotta make sure that everything's tight and right around here.
Okay, so a lot of you have followed the work that we do here at the shop, and you're very familiar with a lot of the products that we've been working on. This particular car is very special. It's near and dear to my heart because not only is the owner of it a really cool guy, but the car is so unusual and so rare that you can't but be drawn in by the uniqueness of it. What you're looking at is at a 1959 Lancia Zagato Sport. Okay, or super sport in certain conversations. In 1959, there was probably, as far as we tell, roughly 60 of these cars produced. Right now, there's less than 30 known to still be around. This being one of them. Unique thing about this particular car is that it was way ahead of its time. It has a transaxle, four-wheel disc brakes. It had an all-aluminum V6 engine. This is stuff that you didn't see in other markets until way later, until the 60s in some cases. And in the American market, you didn't see these kind of applications done until late 70s. Okay, so the thing of it is about this car that makes it so cool is the fact that it is a Zagato. Zagato tend to do really quirky things with their cars. And I say that in that sense because usually this late down the road in its life, it takes an awful lot of effort to save the cars because of the unusual construction of them at the time that they were built. Anyway, so a lot of you are familiar with this car because you saw this car on internet discussion boards 3, 4, 5 years ago when we first started on it. We had since shelved it, had other projects that we were focusing on. Now it's back in the game. Now we're getting back on it with the objective of trying to get this thing wrapped up so it can go to some of the shows in the summertime. That's a really ambitious expectation. Whether we make it or not, I don't know. But the thing of it is we're tackling it now. But this car still has a lot of unique issues with it that Johnny's going to bring you up to speed on. Johnny?
Yeah, so I just want to talk about the aluminum and the metal because we got a metal subframe. Everything from the inside is all steel. Everything on the outside is aluminum. This is just an aluminum skinned metal car. So it's pretty unique because the aluminum rusts in a different rate, in a different manner than steel. And what that's called is galvanic action. You can see some of it here, but if we go to the front of the car, we can check it out some more. Now what used to be here was a framing, right? Made out of this rod, made out of this tubing. This tubing is made out of steel. This skin here is made out of aluminum. So as you can see, the galvanic action going on the aluminum, and that's caused by metal and aluminum coming together and having contact and rubbing up against each other. There's going to be problems when you do that. Obviously, metal rusts, steel rusts. Aluminum does this process called galvanic action, and you can see it going on here. So what we're gonna have to do is, when we do our steel framing with this tubing, what we're gonna do is we're gonna epoxy both pieces of metal with this chromate primer. And after that, we're gonna isolate the two by using a membrane in between the two, so that they don't come in contact with each other anymore.
No, it's not a 6C 1500 or an RL Super Sport. It's a 1933 Packard. It's a fairly rare model Packard. It's their coupe, which ironically they made more convertibles than they did coupes. Yes, I know it's outside what we normally do here at the shop, or at least what you're used to seeing. But the thing of it is what we're doing is not different, and it's something I want to make sure we took a few minutes to talk about. The car is in a bare steel scenario right now. I'm getting ready to put some acid etch primer on it. We've talked about this a few times before, but this is what we call the critical state of the car. Up here in the Northwest, we have a significant amount of relative humidity year-round, because we're obviously notorious for knowing about always raining. So when you have a lot of moisture in the air, though you don't have water actually contacting the car, an open metal like this is absorbing that moisture that's in the air. It's literally wicking it. Okay, so what you have to do is if you get your car blasted, regardless of where you live really, but especially up here, when you get your car blasted, you've got to hurry up and get it in some kind of prime state as soon as possible. This has been blasted about 18 hours ago. Okay, so we need to get it in our acid etch primer immediately. The idea behind acid etch primer is fairly critical. We lay that down before we do anything else, because acid etch primer does exactly as it implies. The longer you leave it undisturbed, the more the etching process digs into the steel and protects that metal for long-term purposes. Okay, so if you're doing your own restoration at home, one, never have your car dipped. You got aluminum blocks and a lot of the cabinetry of the Alfa Romeos. Those aluminum blocks will completely dissolve in a dipping application, so never do that. If you're going to have your car blasted, there's many different processes in which you can use. We have a very particular formulation that our blaster uses that we're quite comfortable with, and it's a granite, ash, and glass mixture. It doesn't superheat the metal and warp the panels. So that's what we use. Now there's all sorts of other options out there. You have dry ice, which is fine, but it doesn't get into the substrate of the metal, so you still have the, if you have rust on that metal, you need to get that rust out, even if it's dormant in the substrate, which means that you don't see it, but it's embedded in the metal. Alfa Romeos, you can always assume that you have rust embedded in the metal, because these cars were notorious for having contaminated steel when it was delivered from the Eastern Bloc, if you will, to the factories in Italy. Okay, so you can always assume that you have contaminated metal. So I wouldn't recommend dry ice. I wouldn't recommend soda, because soda does the same thing as dry ice. It just takes the surface stuff off. It doesn't dig into the metal and change any of the substrate. Okay, so those are not removing contaminations, they're only removing material on top, which leaves us with your best options. Some kind of a aggressive mixture. Okay, granite, ash, and glass mixture seems to be about the right combination, because again, it doesn't superheat the steel and warp the panels. It's aggressive enough that it breaks up the steel to where paint can bond right to it without any additional handling. And it's smooth enough to where it doesn't have this heavy texture feel to it, okay, that you have to sand out at a later date. So that's what we use. That's what I recommend that you have done. Last thing I want to talk about. When you get your car back from blaster, make sure the blaster doesn't touch it, make sure you don't touch it. Always wear gloves, because the oils and the sweat from your hands is going to immediately contaminate that steel. If I put my hand on this and come back in a few hours, you'll see my handprint in a rust form. Okay, so that's just something you need to know. Again, this is where we're at, this is what we do. So though the Packard's not necessarily part of what you normally see coming out of vintage customs, it is what I'm dressing today. sometimes in this line of work it's easy to take for granted what it is we're doing. We've actually had quite a few people ask about what this car is we're working on. It's a substantially large car. It's much larger than those of you in the Alfa world are used to looking at. This is a 1933 Packard coupe. Huge footprint on this car. You can literally fit an Alfa within the wheelbase of this. This car company was actually rather revolutionary in its time. Before it eventually became, it morphed into a lot of other car companies and kind of disappeared off the face of the earth. But Packard was instrumental in a lot of ways and revolutionary at the same time. For example, in the late 30s, they were producing the Merlin engine for the P-51 Mustangs and for Rolls-Royce for the Spitfire industry as well. So they were really well known for some of their engineering capabilities. This particular car, now think about this, 1933 technology. This car's been on the road for 80 plus years, and every nut and bolt on this thing is undisturbed, and it's all just coming apart quite well. It's something amazing about how they built their cars. But the thing of it is Packard in the 30s was probably Cadillac's biggest competitor in the U.S. market. They built and designed cars that were just extraordinary works of art.